This is Y490 Politics of the Internet. This lecture was originally delivered on February 1, 2012. The lecture concerns the digital divide. The digital divide is the gap in computer and internet use across various social groups. One of the key questions there is about who to include and who to exclude in deciding which groups to compare, and what are the consequences of gaps across groups. How stable are these differences over time, and what should be done about that? There are a number of books that sort of set the agenda for research on the global digital divide. The original report written for the Commerce Department in 1998 called Falling Through the Net. Then a book written by Benjamin Compain called Bridging the Digital Divide in 2001. In the same year, a book by Pippa Norris called The Digital Divide, and more recently a book by Jan van Dijk on the Deepening Divide, published in 2005. In Jan van Dijk and Joseph Hacker's work, the main focus is on barriers to access, which may go beyond simply the ability to access the equipment. First of all, education, what they call mental access, the lack of particularly elementary digital experiences, either caused by lack of interest, computer anxiety, or unattractiveness of the new technology. They also, of course, focus on access to the equipment itself, which they call material access. Then there's the question of digital skills. Even though you may have good background in digital technology, you may not have the specific skills. And finally, lack of significant usage opportunities. So you may not have sufficient access to the equipment and the skills required to use it. At the individual level, barriers to access include language skills, basic literacy skills, and electronic literacy. In the United States, at the end of the last decade, there were major differences by age group, with older Americans less likely to use the internet than younger ones. People with more education, obviously, more likely to use the internet. People who come from households with higher incomes, more likely to use the internet. Some differences between ethnic and racial groups, particularly Spanish language households tended to be the lowest users, although interestingly, African Americans were considerably higher than both Latinos and Spanish language households. Differences between rural and urban uses were not so great by 2009, but still there was some difference. In terms of the digital divide across the entire globe, there's considerable difference across countries with different levels of economic development as measured by gross domestic product per capita. Also, countries where telephones are hard to access, where electrical power grids are not reliable, where computers are too expensive, tend to have low usage. Also, the absence of competition in telecommunications markets, monopolies and oligopolies of various kinds can be a barrier. Also, the lack of investment in human capital, particularly in formal education, tends to be a major barrier. And then authoritarian regimes tend to be less welcoming of information technology, particularly for communication across people and across groups, than democratic regimes. If we think about the map of the global digital divide, you think about the number of computers per person. The dark areas here are the ones with the highest computer density, and therefore the most likely to have lots of internet users. The yellow areas have the lowest computer density, and you'll notice that they're concentrated primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Latin America, and to some degree in South Asia. The number of people online or offline varies considerably across countries, with countries like Iceland being high on the scale, countries like Ethiopia being very low on the scale, as you would expect because of low per capita income. But some countries are surprisingly high, like South Korea, um, and some countries are lower than you might expect given their rate of technological development. So Russia doesn't score quite as high as you would expect, I think. This map shows by the height of each area the sort of frequency of internet use, showing that the United States, North America more generally, Western Europe and Australia are, combined with Japan and Korea, are fairly high users, whereas Africa are fairly low, and most of the third world, including the former communist world, considerably lower. If we look at total users by geographic region, there are the most number of users in Asia, followed by Europe, North America, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Oceania. Roughly 1.7 billion users by the midpoint of 2009. Probably that number is closer to 2 billion by now. If we compare the percentage of population that has PCs and that are internet users with the per capita income, average per capita income of the country, then you can see that the richer countries tend to have much more PC and internet usage. So there's fairly considerable differences between the developing countries and the industrialized or high-income countries. Within the developing countries, the least developed countries have the lowest usage. Their usage in Latin America is higher than in East Asia and the Pacific overall, which is higher than the Arab states. The Central and Eastern European states are somewhere between the developing countries and the wealthy OECD countries. So part of the problem for people in the developing world is the lack of access to telephone lines, much less high-speed internet services. This seems to be a fairly stubborn statistic, although there has been obviously some improvement over time. The mobile telephones have spread much more rapidly in the developing countries than fixed landline phones. And so a lot of people in the developing world get access to the internet through their smartphones or their third generation phones, as opposed to many people in the developed world who mainly get access through PCs and laptops. Okay. Then there's the question of the speed of the connection. Obviously, broadband connections are faster than dial-up connections, and there is considerable difference both across and within countries concerning access to broadband connections. The cost of broadband, of course, is considerably higher than the cost of dial-up access, and more and more services on the internet are sort of premised on the availability of broadband connections, so it's difficult to get audio and video on dial-up because the connection is too slow. Broadband has pretty much replaced dial-up in wealthy countries like the United States. As you can see, a very small percentage of users by May 2011 were still dependent on dial-up services. In different countries, there's been a different uptake of broadband services, with South Korea being the fastest to take it up. The Scandinavian countries fairly quick. The UK, the United States, also somewhat lower, but still pretty good take up. And as you would expect, the former communist countries and developing countries considerably slower in offering broadband services or in being able to sell them at a reasonable price. The United States, remarkably, in 2009 was not the #1 user of broadband in terms of percentage of households, but rather was #9. So that's been a focus of a lot of politics over broadband in the United States, the fact that the U.S. is behind countries like Korea, Iceland, and Sweden. As I said before, the higher the family income, generally speaking, the higher the usage of the internet and other kinds of information technology. Generally speaking, the more educated are more likely to use these technologies. There's not a clear correlation between age and usage, although obviously older people tend to use it a little bit less than younger people. People in their middle ages tend to use the internet services less than younger people, particularly in the 18 to 24 age range. Just threw in this picture for the demonstration that there's been a rather major increase in the use of computers and the internet by elderly people. And here is some ladies from a village somewhere, probably in Central Europe. Actually Turkey. So if we look at gaps by gender, there is a tendency for males to be more likely to use, but those gaps have decreased considerably in recent years. So gender is not as big gender gaps are not as big an issue as other types of gaps. A lot of times people don't use these technologies because they aren't interested in them, they're too expensive, they don't have a computer, and so forth. So there's quite a lot of study on that question as to what are the main reasons for not using computers, and that's one shouldn't always consider non-use as a kind of deprivation. Sometimes it's entirely voluntary on the part of the individual. Attitudes about computers and the internet vary considerably across countries. You can see that in Singapore, one of the big issues is not knowing about how to use the technology, whereas, for example, in the Czech Republic, not having a connection is a big issue. In Hungary, the connections are too expensive, according to responses from surveys. So, as I said before, there are a number of reasons, not all of them connected with income or education, which are connected with use or non-use of these technologies. One of the ways of sort of taking this literature and turning it into some kind of action plan is to think about what are the barriers and to work on those variables that have some possibility for being manipulated by public policy or at various levels of government. So schools are obviously a big source of focus as to whether computing and internet resources are available in the schools, whether the schools can provide training and basic literacy, but obviously more importantly general literacy, so that the knowledge that can be obtained via the internet will be useful for individuals. And there's also the question of the attitudinal basis of whether you feel that these technologies add to the quality of your life or not, and there's some role for schools to play a role there as well. One of the areas of politics over internet access is the movement to measure more carefully exactly what is the availability of broadband as opposed to dial-up. An organization called Broadband Census.com undertook the idea of using crowdsourcing or input from internet users to find out what speeds were available to those people in different locations. And that turned into a broader broadband mapping exercise that eventually became a piece of governmental legislation. The Broadband Data Improvement Act of 2008, Senate Bill 1492, passed in the 110th Congress in 2008, required the FCC to compile a list of geographical areas that are not served by any provider of advanced telecommunications services. It mandates the use of census data to characterize each area by population density, and per capita income, and then requires the Federal Communications Commission to publish international comparisons of broadband access. In the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which followed the election of President Obama, that act added a broadband technology opportunities program, created a national broadband inventory map through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and the creation of a national broadband plan. So the questions that we raise in this lecture have to do with whether the digital divide exists and whether it matters or not. What are the main causes of the global and local and national digital divides? Do higher levels of internet diffusion and use reduce the digital divide within and between countries? Are there new digital divides, for example, between broadband and dial-up that are important? And what's happening over time? Are these gaps getting smaller or bigger?